We're jumping straight into the sources today, and we're looking at something really critical. This undeniable link between the Kremlin getting much more aggressive, rhetorically at least, abroad, and the fact that support for the war back home is, well, it's sinking fast.
It's a fascinating dynamic, isn't it? A real paradox. The longer this goes on, the heavier the cost. Politically, economically, it becomes unsustainable. So Moscow feels forced, really, to deploy this very specific propaganda playbook. It's all about externalizing the conflict, frame Russia as the victim, always the victim. And, kind of ironically, they actually ramp up the military brinkmanship to make that story stick.
Right, and that's our mission today. We're going to try and dissect this information push. We've got sources laying out the polling data, the sort of high-level diplomatic talk, and the specific state media tools they're using, all aimed at managing this growing fatigue at home by painting the West as this big unified threat.
And it's dangerous. It's really quite dangerous because they're not just talking. They are actively, escalating things at the border, testing NATO defenses with aircraft, with drones, while telling their own people, look, we're the ones under attack.
Right.
Understanding how they bridge that gap, that's key.
Okay, let's unpack this then, starting with the situation inside Russia. Because the backdrop to all this is this pressure cooker of war fatigue. Just how bad is the data on public support for the war in Ukraine?
It's really stark. It's sinking to historic lows, and you have to consider the sheer weight of the duration. It's immense. The sources we have highlight that the conflict is now nearing its fourth year.
Fourth year? Wow.
Yeah, think about that. They point out, and this is significant, this duration now actually surpasses the Soviet Union's fight against Nazi Germany, the Great Patriotic War, which is absolutely central to Russian identity, to their historical memory.
That specific comparison, that's not accidental, is it? Why bring up the Great Patriotic War now? What's the strategic value in that reference for the Kremlin?
Oh, it's hugely important because invoking that memory, it reframes the current war. It casts it as a defensive, almost existential struggle, just like that war. Remember, the initial framing was this quick, special military operation, limited goals, supposedly. Now, years later, the economy's hurting, people are tired, the toll is mounting. They have to redefine it. It needs to feel like something worth the immense sacrifice, something on par with the biggest struggle in their history. They need to justify why people have had to endure this for so long.
And we have data confirming this endurance is really wearing thin. It's not just guesswork. We've got polling from the Levada Center, generally seen as, well, one of the more reliable gauges we have in this context. What are those numbers telling us?
They're pretty unambiguous. Levada's data shows that full two-thirds of Russians now say they support negotiations for peace. And maybe even more telling, support for continuing the military action indefinitely. That's fallen quite dramatically. It's at its lowest point since the invasion began back in 2022.
Okay, so two-thirds of your population want talks. They want the fighting to stop. Yeah. That's a potential political crisis right there. So that majority, that two-thirds, they become the #1 target for the Kremlin's whole information machine, right? You can't deliver peace talks easily, so you have to change the subject.
Exactly. The narrative has to shift completely. The focus moves away from, are we winning in Ukraine or when will this end? Suddenly, the issue becomes national survival against NATO, against the West. So if you've got that internal exhaustion, the political response has to be an external threat, a big one. And that leads us straight into this NATO playbook they're running.
And it's critical to note, this isn't just talk. This external threat narrative is backed up by specific, quite high-risk actions.
Precisely. Just in recent weeks, we've seen multiple reports from NATO members like Poland, Lithuania, Estonia. They're reporting Russian aircraft, Russian drones, testing their air defenses, probing their zones, sometimes even violating airspace. This isn't just posturing from afar. It's active military brinkmanship right there on NATO's eastern edge.
And NATO, quite rightly, calls this irresponsible behavior. But Moscow, they just grab that condemnation and twist it. How do they spin these aggressive moves into making them look like the victims?
Immediately. It's an instant counter-narrative. They paint NATO not as the defender reacting to their probes, but as the aggressor, the provocateur trying to corner Russia. The spin is essentially, see how jumpy they are. See how they overreact when we just conduct normal exercises near our own border. They are the ones looking for a fight.
And this is where the diplomatic theater really kicks in. You mentioned Foreign Minister Lavrov's comments at the UN. He's taking this victim narrative global.
Yes, Lavrov made a very specific, very charged accusation. He claimed Western leaders were, and I quote, openly talking about preparations for an attack on our Kaliningrad region. That's designed to hit hard. Maximize fear at home. Project this image of Western aggression abroad.
But our sources highlight something absolutely critical he left out the context. For you listening, trying to make sense of this rhetoric, what was the actual context of those Western remarks about Kaliningrad that Lavrov conveniently ignored?
Yes, the context. That's the core of the manipulation. Look, Western military analysts and planners do discuss Kaliningrad. Of course they do. It's a heavily militarized Russian exclave bordering NATO members. But those discussions almost always happen in a hypothetical defensive scenario. They're talking about, what if Russia attacks? How would NATO defend its territory? Or what deterrence measures are needed to prevent Russian aggression there? Lavrov just stripped all that conditionality away. He took the what-if defensive planning and presented it as a concrete offensive plan by the West to attack Russia.
Preemptively.
It's a deliberate twisting of reality, decontextualization as a weapon, really, to shock the domestic audience. And this fear-mongering wasn't just Lavrov. President Putin himself amplified it straight away. Absolutely. Putin followed up almost immediately, issued these stern warnings about concrete military technical measures if the West escalates. You see this synchronization. The diplomat lays the groundwork. We're victims. And then the president comes in with the military threat, and we're forced to react. It completes the picture. Russia is just defending itself against an immediate danger.
So if we connect these actions, the flights near NATO, the diplomatic threats, back to that internal pressure, it seems the whole point is to shift the focus entirely away from problems at home or, setbacks in Ukraine.
The national conversation changes instantly. That's the goal. Instead of people asking, why are we still fighting in Ukraine? What's the cost? The Kremlin wants them asking, how do we possibly defend ourselves against this massive threat from the entire West?
Which takes us right into the mechanics, the tools they use for this psychological mobilization. Because analysts, like Andrei Kolesnikov, they're quick to point out this whole propaganda effort. It's aimed squarely at those weary Russians we talked about earlier.
Right. And Kolesnikov's analysis is quite pointed. He argued essentially that Putin's regime cannot exist without confrontation. And that sounds stark, but it's getting at something fundamental about how the system works. The state needs that sense of ongoing conflict, that external enemy, to justify its control, its spending, its clamp down on dissent, especially when the public is getting restless about the war.
So the goal isn't just to justify the war, it's deeper. It's justifying the regime's very existence, convincing people that they're the only thing standing between Russia and total collapse, orchestrated by the West. How does state media hammer this message home?
Well, the state media machine acts like a giant echo chamber, just blasting this out 24/7. They consistently frame the conflict not just as U.S.-led aggression, they also make a point of painting Europe specifically as divided and erratic, which is interesting. It sort of minimizes Europe's actual military threat, but maximizes its perceived malice. It suggests Europe is maybe weak, but hateful enough to want to attack Russia anyway.
Can you give us some specific examples? Who are the key players driving this on TV, and what does it look like? The sources name some prominent figures.
Oh, yes. Figures like Olga Skabayeva and Vladimir Solovyov are absolutely central to this. You see them on primetime state TV, and they often go to rhetorical extremes. For instance, they'll ridicule NATO's decision-making processes, call them slow and weak. But then in the next breath, they might casually threaten nuclear strikes or overwhelming retaliation. It serves to normalize the idea of extreme confrontation, makes it seem like a constant reality, and heightens that sense of immediate danger.
And this isn't just happening on TV, right? This message gets echoed across the digital sphere, too.
Correct. It's a whole ecosystem. Pro-Kremlin bloggers, influential Telegram channels, various state-linked websites and accounts. They all amplify this rhetoric almost instantly. They'll dismiss Western concerns about Russian military flights as, hysterical or exaggerated, while at the same time constantly boasting about Russia's strength, its resolve, its readiness. It's all designed to create this overwhelming sense of consensus. The message is, dissent is practically treason, and talking peace is naive because the West simply can't be trusted.
So the core message to the Russian public becomes brutally simple. Yes, this war is hard. Yes, it's costly. But that's because the West is fundamentally hostile and trying to destroy us. This confrontation isn't a choice. It's a necessity for survival.
That's precisely it. They've managed quite effectively for now to turn internal fatigue and maybe even weakness into a justification for external aggression and strength. They shift the burden. It's not about our war aims anymore. It's about their hostility.
Okay, so pulling these different threads together, what we're seeing is a very clear two-pronged strategy from the Kremlin. Prong one, Double down on military confrontation, ramp up the rhetoric directed outwards towards NATO and the West. Prong 2. Simultaneously run this intense information campaign at home to manage public opinion, suppress any dissent, and keep people mobilized, psychologically at least.
And the ultimate goal, let's be clear, is to sustain the war effort indefinitely. Despite that huge chunk of the population, that two-thirds wanting it to end, they seem to have calculated that the only way to keep going is to make the external threat seem exponentially bigger, more immediate, more existential than the actual grinding war in Ukraine itself.
Which makes the stakes incredibly high, doesn't it? Because they are deliberately increasing military risk-taking. Risking a miscalculation with NATO, essentially, as a tool for domestic political management. And that brings us back to Putin's warning, those concrete military technical measures. What might those actually look like, based on the analysis?
Well, given the context, that link between needing to show strength externally because of internal pressure, these threats usually point towards visible actions, high-impact deployments. Sources speculate it could mean things like moving certain missile systems closer to NATO borders, announcing permanent increases in troop numbers in border regions, or maybe even highly visible naval deployments or Air Force posture changes, something designed to dramatically raise the military temperature. The key thing is, the measures need to be concrete enough, visible enough for the domestic audience to see them and believe the threat narrative, but ideally without actually triggering a direct war with NATO.
It really highlights how the regime's political needs, its need to project strength because of that internal dynamic, are driving external risk. That's something we need to watch very, very closely.
It's the ultimate tightrope walk, isn't it? Balancing internal political survival against external military danger. And right now, it seems the internal pressure is really dictating the pace of the external actions.
So here's a final thought for you, our listener, to mull over after this deep dive. Given that this Kremlin strategy seems to require continuous, escalating confrontation to counteract that falling public support at home, if that support keeps dropping, what specific forms might the next phase of those concrete military technical measures actually take? What else could they do to manufacture that sense of crisis without tipping over the edge into catastrophic war?
That internal political engine, that's what's truly driving the escalation right now.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.